Years ago, and I do mean years ago, so it's actually kind of annoying to find, I remember the YouTube channel Today I Found Out had a poll asking their audience what topic they most would like to learn about. The leading answer, with 33% of the votes, was a history of the USSR. I remember at the time thinking that kind of made sense, as overproduction of mostly disposed products pollutes the earth, and corporations lobby government to prevent meaningful response to what is shaping up to be the sixth mass extinction event in world history, while simultaneously crashing the economy and with it the livelihoods of millions. It makes sense that people would be interested in an alternative, and no country has been as synonymous with the alternative to capitalism as the USSR. Many of the comments under the post were asking for an unbiased account of the Soviet Union's history. There is this idea in popular culture that history is written by the victors, and that the accounts we often hear from countries like the USSR are told from only one perspective, that there should be an unbiased retelling of this history. This video is not going to be that. Nor could any video really be. The USSR is too controversial and influential a state for there to ever be a truly unbiased account of its history. Instead, this video will be from the pro-Soviet perspective, and seek to explain why the other half of the world once took this side. But just because we can't ever be truly free from bias doesn't mean we shouldn't try to account for these biases. So in this video, I'm going to quote from a wide array of sources from historians and intellectuals from across the political spectrum. I'll quote conservative and liberal historians who, although being capitalists who obviously dislike the USSR, still find some redeeming qualities with it. I'll be quoting democratic socialists who, while they may be sympathetic to the social aspects of the Soviet Union, remain critical of what they see as an authoritarian system. And lastly, I'll be quoting Marxist historians who, while being obviously more sympathetic to the Soviet Union, are also well-respected experts in the history of this period. I will list my sources down below with an explanation next to each source to the historian's political biases as far as I can tell, so you know what bias they are coming from. Finally, my video is going to be broken down into 3 distinct parts, focusing on issues familiar to basically every progressive-minded American. 1. Overall improvement, being the many ways the USSR benefited the people who lived in it. 2. Being women's rights, how the Soviet Union bettered the other half of humanity. And 3. Being racial rights, how the Soviet Union's policies benefited the rights of ethnic minorities better than almost any major power of its day. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. And small warning, this is going to be a very data-centric video, so be prepared for that. Russia emerged into the 20th century with a quasi-feudal economy just one step out of the Middle Ages. Not a good start for a country, you see, and that would only be the beginning. After here, the Soviet Union would be invaded by 14 different countries after World War I. After a generation of recovery, the Nazis would invade, killing over 26 million people and destroying a fifth of the entire Soviet economy. 12 years later, less time from the first election of Barack Obama to now, the USSR would launch Sputnik and catapult humanity into the space age. The Soviet Union's accomplishments are far more impressive, and their shortcomings far more understandable when we get into the conditions they came from. In terms of economic development, pre-Soviet Tsarist Russia was the most backwards large country in all of Europe. Russia only abolished serfdom, the feudal economic system which completely made peasants tied to the land and subsequently their landlords, basically slavery, in 1861. Compare this to France, which effectively abolished serfdom in 1318, meaning late-era Tsarist Russia was over half a millennia less economically progressive than 100 Years' War-era France. There's actually a laundry list of different ways we can use to measure how backwards Tsarist Russia was economically. The GDP per head of Imperial Russia was more comparable to some of the poorest regions on Earth at the time than they were to their European rivals. One of the major indicators of economic development is urbanization, the rate at which rural populations go to cities to work. Generally, the higher the percentage of a country's population that is rural, the poorer and less developed that country is. 87% of Russia was rural by 1905, equal to, if not more, than any nation on Earth today. 3/4 of the population were peasant farmers, yet in spite of being such an agriculturally based society, the vast majority of Tsarist Russia was constantly hungry. From 873 to early 1900s, Russia experienced 120 different famines. From 1895 to 1910, just a little over a century ago, per capita caloric intake was 2,100 calories per day, about 200 calories less than France was in 1785, 600 less than England was in 1790, and the equal of current-day Haiti. Infant mortality was about 24%, meaning a quarter of all infants died, which is over twice as high as any third world nation currently. As a result of this, life expectancy was abysmal at just 34 years in 1915, almost 2 decades lower than the lowest on Earth today, being 53. Because the vast majority of the population was simultaneously tethered to agriculture and starving, the need for intellectual advancement was virtually nil. Literacy was around 56% prior to the revolution, far less than any of their rival countries. By 1913, Russia was on a percentage basis further behind the Western powers than it was back in the 1820s. By virtually every relevant metric measuring the quality of life of the average citizen of the Tsarist Empire you could possibly want to look at, be it life expectancy, infant mortality, caloric intake, industrial output, literacy rate, higher education achievement, Tsarist Russia was not only not the equal of its Western counterparts, it was a third world country, not just by the standards of today, but by the standards of its own time. And it was this already third world Russia that was about to be completely annihilated and reduced even further by 8 years of first global and then civil war. Pre-industrial Russia was not yet ready for war with the Kaiserreich, to put it mildly, and lost more soldiers every individual month of involvement in 1917 than America lost in the entirety of the Vietnam War combined. Russia was completely devastated, and after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the country would break into an open civil war, with the conservative whites refusing to be led by these new Reds. 14 capitalist countries would invade to back these whites and prevent the establishment of the new socialist state. Chaos would ensue. By 1922, some 16 million people in Soviet territory would die from either World War I or the Russian Civil War that followed. Illiteracy would skyrocket, with what little industrial development Russia had before being completely destroyed. The mass death and destruction forced 7 million children into homelessness, usually forming gangs and delinquent groups to try to survive. 88% of homeless girls aged 15 and younger became child prostitutes. It was out of this completely destroyed pit of a country, with no infrastructure, no living standards worthy of the name, and no anything, that the Soviet Union would emerge out of. When capitalists talk about the Soviet Union, you'll almost always hear them say that the Soviet Union destroyed the Russian economy, as if a non-destroyed economy is capable of producing a communist revolution in the first place. When people talk about the economic comparison between the USSR and the USA, and how, in some aspects, the US was superior and won the Cold War, they always leave out the conditions that these two countries came from. The United States emerged into the 20th century an already industrialized state. Russia entered it as a quasi-Middle Ages era empire. America, because of its excellent geography, having the world's largest ocean to its west, second largest to its east, a friendly nation to its north, and weak nation to its south, was basically completely protected from the disastrous effects of both world wars. Because of this, not only would America not lose almost no civilians or workers in the world wars, they were the only major power to actually have their industrial capabilities boosted rather than destroyed. Meanwhile, the USSR, being mostly part of Europe, lost over 40 million people in a 30-year span, and had to rebuild their entire industry from the ground up twice. Not only this, but the USSR's ability to recover from all this damage was severely restricted compared to the US. While America, through the Marshall Plan, would be able to rebuild and gain rich industrialized nations from Western Europe to Japan as allies, and thus gain trade and access to their wealth, the USSR's only allies at the end of World War II were these small Eastern European nations it conquered during World War II, almost all of them even poorer and more destroyed than the Soviet Union itself. Then the only allies they would gain after this would be the countries that had their own communist revolutions, i.e. exclusively third world countries poorer than the Soviet Union itself. Ignoring both capitalism and socialism as ideologies or economic systems, America at every single turn had literally every economic and political advantage over the Soviet Union physically possible. And in spite of this overwhelming American advantage, the USSR would accomplish some of the greatest wonders in human history, raising living standards and well-being to greater extents than almost any nation in history before or since. In order to industrialize, the Soviets would push forward a series of 5-year plans, where a general direction of the economy would be voted on and planned out in order to achieve whatever desirable outcomes they believed possible, and chief among these outcomes was industrialization. Being so far behind the capitalist powers, the Soviet Union was incapable of defending itself from them if push came to shove, let alone supplying a good standard of living for its citizens. So they would begin a massive funding of machinery, transportation, education, and all other things that make industrialization possible. When it came to heavy industry, aspirational targets inspired rapid growth of almost every relevant material. In the decade from 27 to 37, pig iron production would grow almost 5-fold, from 3.3 million tons to 14.5 million tons. Both crude petroleum and cement production would almost triple, electric power would increase 6-fold, and coal would increase almost 4 times over. The development of machinery would grow over 17-fold, and motor vehicle production would increase nearly 280 times over. Farming would increase as well, as machinery greatly reduced the manpower needed to increase crop yields, labor requirements in grain growing nearly halved from the 20s to late 30s. It would allow rural men and women to migrate to cities en masse for the first time, seeking new industrial jobs and the benefits of full employment. The Soviet system would begin to migrate others towards the cities, mimicking the same development that happened to capitalist nations, only in a fraction of the time. Over 23 million people would migrate from the late 20s to the early 30s, nearly doubling the urban population. The populations of cities like Moscow and Leningrad would more or less double at this exact same time. The Soviet Union was quickly developing from a quasi-feudal backwater into an industrial superpower, the second greatest power of its century. However, because of their socialist nature, the Soviet Union would put more emphasis on using these accomplishments and advancements to distribute and benefit the population at large. These massive increases in distribution of agricultural technology led to one of the fastest increases in caloric intake in human history. Even the American government found that the Soviet caloric intake was equal to that of the United States, with the Soviet diet actually being more nutritious, from one of the most starvation-afflicted countries on Earth to one of its most well-fed. Previously, Tsarist Russia was the most disease-ridden country in all of Europe. From 1823 to 1922, Russia suffered 5.5 million cases of cholera, leading to 2.2 million deaths. One of the main reasons for Imperial Russia's backward results was its near-complete non-existence of medical or health infrastructure. In 1914, only 204 out of the largest 1,063 cities had waterworks facilities, and of those, only 145 actually used filters. Only 17 cities in all of Russia had sewer systems, and out of the 224 most populated cities in Russia, 96 lacked significant medical organization and 139 significant sanitary preparation. It wasn't even that the Tsarist system couldn't help these people, it's that it simply didn't care. The Tsar's top physician himself estimated that the government spent only about 1 ruble per inhabitant on public health. This would change under the Bolsheviks who, even in the throngs of their apocalyptic civil war, would usher in one of the largest public health interventions in history. The Bolsheviks would use their railroads to conduct checkpoints and set up education and vaccination centers, slowing down the rate of cholera. Building off some of the few positive Tsarist health policies, the Soviets would reduce over 30,000 liters of cholera vaccine, and in 1921, 27 million doses of cholera and typhoid vaccine, and over 2 million for diphtheria. During the first 10 months of 1920, over 4 million people would attend lectures related to sanitation, educating the masses. Even Western sources of the time applauded this Bolshevik crusade against disease. The London Times wrote that the preventative measures under the Soviet government were better organized than under the Tsarist regime, testifying to their organizational talent. From 1923 to 1927, the cases of malaria in the USSR dropped from 5.7 million cases to 3.7 million, and smallpox from 46,000 to 15,000 cases. Later, cholera would be ended as an endemic Russian disease. And this would be only the beginning. The vast increase of funding for public health in the Soviet Union led to many advancements in medical technology for all of humanity. The Soviet Union performed the first cadaver blood transfusion in 1930, creating the basis of the American blood bank system. The first human kidney transplant in human history would be done in 1933 in the Soviet Union, and the first heart and lung transplant on dogs would be done in 1946, creating the basis of the later human heart and lung transplants. The first artificial heart would be developed in 1937, and they invented radial keratotomy in 1974, the precursor to cataract surgery. This would only be a fraction of the USSR's medical gifts to the world. Smallpox is one of the deadliest diseases in human history, killing between 300 and 500 million people in the 20th century alone, a fraction of its 3,000-year history. Famously, it killed over 90% of the population of 2 different continents. The Soviets would eliminate smallpox morbidity by 1936. Based off this success, Soviet scientist Viktor Standov came to believe this could be accomplished worldwide, suggesting to initiate a worldwide program of smallpox eradication at the 9th World Health Assembly. This corresponding resolution was adopted at the 7th World Health Assembly plenary meeting of June 12, 1958. After initiating this global program, the Soviet Union would manufacture 1.5 billion doses of smallpox vaccine to be used in 45 nations, more than any other nation on Earth. Smallpox eventually was eradicated on May 8, 1980, the first ever disease to be eradicated in human history. Considering the hundreds of millions of lives the disease took in just the first 7 decades of the 20th century, and humanity's population growth since, this disease eradication has probably saved hundreds of millions of lives. It is humanity's greatest achievement, and while the whole world did participate, the Soviet Union played a larger role and accomplished more than any other individual nation. From the most disease-ridden country in all of Europe to one of the greatest contributors of human health in human history. Infant mortality in 1915 pre-Soviet Russia was 237 per thousand, meaning almost a quarter of all infants would die. By 1975, this would be reduced to 26 per thousand, a drop of about 90%, saving tens of millions of infants. All this decrease of infant mortality and advancement in food and healthcare caused one of the fastest increases of life expectancy in human history. Life expectancy in 1915 was a little over 33 years. By 1975, it would be almost 69 years. The Soviets were also huge believers in public education. Only 38% of Russian adults were literate in 1918. This increased to about 81% in 1931, with this disproportionately benefiting women, who in 1897 were 3 times less likely to be literate than men. This difference ceased to exist by the late 1930s. From here, it would increase to 99.7% in the 70s and 80s, representing more or less total literacy. Not only this, but according to UNESCO in 1965, the USSR published 80,000 copies of written works, and in Russian alone represented the highest amount of published works of any nation in the world, from the most illiterate nation in Europe to arguably the most literate nation on Earth at the time. Not only this, but the education of the Soviet Union citizens would go far beyond mere literacy. From 1914 to 1915, the number of citizens of the Russian Empire enrolled in higher education was only 80 out of 100,000. By 1968 and 1969, this rose to over 1,800 out of 100,000, a rise of over 95%. So the Soviet Union didn't just extend their lives, they massively benefited them as well, to the extent that the rest of the world would have to catch up. To quote a previous video I made responding to Vosh, the general history of the left coincides quite strongly with the history of the Soviet Union. Starting in the 1920s, the Soviet Union was just starting out, the left was relatively weak. As the 30s hit and capitalist countries had to cope with the Great Depression and the Soviet Union's economy grew largely unaffected, the left would grow in power. As the Soviet Union reached the height of power and influence in the 60s, the international left was also at the height of its power. And as the Soviet Union declined in the 70s and 80s, you saw the rise of neoliberalism and the decline of the international left. Finally, as the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, you see the rise of third-way Clintonism and the abandonment of the Democrats of any attempt to even try to look left-wing. With the existence of a strong socialist country and rising communist parties around the world, the capitalist class was forced to give many concessions to workers. In 1919, the International Labor Organization, or ILO, would be founded, largely in response to the Bolshevik Revolution. It formed the first international tripartite organization dedicated to labor, bringing together leaders of countries' companies and workers in an attempt to mediate differences without revolution. The organization saw the limiting and banning of child labor in member nations, and is one of the main reasons why sweatshops and child labor declined so much in Western countries post-World War I. The massive benefit to the lives of workers both in and out of the Soviet Union would end after its fall. The collapse of the Soviet Union and introduction of capitalism caused one of the largest decreases in life expectancy in modern history. According to the National Institute of Health, an official website of the United States government, between 2.5 and 3 million Russians died between 1922 and 2001, who would not have died had the Soviet standards of living in 1991 continued. And that's just one source. The Lancet, a British medical journal, found that in 1990 to 1995, 7 million people in ex-Soviet states died premature deaths, and quoted earlier reports that found that the privatization was associated with higher mortality rates. In fact, children born during the years of collapse are on average 1.1 centimeters shorter on average, which might not sound like much, but is about equivalent to what you find in children born in war zones. The collapse of the Soviet Union is perhaps the deadliest event on Earth in the last 40 years. Socialism historically has cared about far more than just economic inequality. From the earliest history of socialism, a significant amount of time and energy has been spent by socialists on the issue of gender and racial inequality. In fact, the word feminism itself was actually coined by French socialist Charles Fourier in 1837. International Women's Day was originally celebrated as Working Women's Day, a socialist holiday. Marxists believe that traditional gender roles play a large role in the maintenance of capitalism. Historically, it was the unpaid labor of women, the raising of children, the cleaning of the house, the cooking for the husband, etc., that allowed for men to be able to enter the workforce and supply all the necessary labor for the benefit of the bosses and growth of capitalism. Women in the traditional nuclear family are forced out of the workforce so that they can become essentially broodmares for the state, deprived of the right to self-actualization in the name of producing the next generation of workers. Thus, it's no coincidence that almost every socialist state has made increasing women's rights a prerogative, with Lenin writing in 1919 that, in the course of 2 years of Soviet power in one of the most backwards countries of Europe, more has been done to emancipate women to make her the equal of the strong sex than has been done during the last 130 years by all the advanced enlightened democratic republics of the world taken together. Rosaline B. Levinson, a woman who at many times in her work is both supportive of and critical of Soviet gender policy, says that the Bolsheviks were probably the first to proclaim, by law, full equality for women in all aspects of life. This was no mere boasting. The Soviets would see one of the greatest emancipations of the other half of humanity of any state in human history. Continuing off of the July Revolution, they would become one of the first countries where women got the right to vote, the first country to legalize abortion, allow women into the workforce, to push women into the sciences, to pass maternity leave, to make sexual harassment illegal, and in 1922, the first country to ban marital rape. The U.S. didn't ban marital rape countrywide until 1993, with the first state abolishing it only in 1974, meaning that for pretty much the entire history of the Cold War, it was legal to rape your wife in the United States, but not the Soviet Union. And this was only the beginning. As the Soviet Union would guarantee full employment to all its citizens, this allowed women to enter the workforce decades prior to their Western counterparts, gaining access to income outside of their men. This allowed them a much greater level of autonomy, having the ability to determine their own futures and careers to an extent that honestly dwarfs the West at the time. In the early 1960s, for example, the USSR gave 40% of chemistry PhDs to women, compared to only about 5% in the United States at the time. The Soviet Union did such a good job representing women in science that they were actually able to force America to become more progressive. After the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the US would pass the National Defense Education Act 1 year later, the first federal student aid made available to women in U.S. history. Likewise, Title IX was passed in order to better compete with Soviet Olympic medal counts. And even after all those concessions, Soviet women were still about 3 times more likely to become economists, 9 times more likely to become engineers, and over twice as likely to become biologists, 3 times more likely to become chemists, and about 3 times more likely to become physicists, and 6 times more likely to be elected to public office than their American counterparts. Another thing that would advance women's rights was socializing childcare, lowering the burden of raising the next generation off of just women and distributing it to the population at large. Eventually, subsidized daycare in the 70s was applied to over half of urban Soviet children and a third of rural children, compared to just about 10% for women in the United States at the time. The vast majority of this progress would be undone with the fall of the Soviet Union, however. With the reintroduction of capitalism came a more patriarchal system. Women would be systematically pushed back out of employment and back into the domination of men. Unemployment, non-existent under communism, was much higher in the female labor force, and women had more difficulties transferring public to private sector due to widespread social stigma. As men have retained greater control of women in the home, domestic violence has likewise increased, helped by the fact that, with the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, Russia decriminalized domestic violence in causes where it does not cause substantial bodily harm, and does not happen more than once a year. While the Soviet Union was the first country to criminalize sexual harassment, since its collapse in 1991, only 2 women have won cases accusing men of sexual harassment in Russia. Not 2%, 2. Of the smaller number of women who are still employed, their bosses wield significant power over them. In 2008, the Daily Telegraph quoted a survey in which 100% of female professionals in Russia said they had been subject to sexual harassment by their bosses, 32% said they had intercourse with them at least once, and another 7% claimed to have. And unfortunately, that's just a small part of how women's lives have been made much, much worse after the fall of the Soviet Union. The number of rape reports skyrocketed in the late 80s and early 90s, while the number of rapes are unfortunately likely underestimated. In just 3 years from 1990 to 1993, there was an over 20% increase in the number of reported rapes. Every year, between 20 and 60,000 Russian women become victims of traffickers, with no less than 500,000 having been trafficked from the country since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This period of history is where the Russian mail-order bride joke comes from. In modern Russia, victim blaming has become common. This makes sense. It works as a justification for why rape and assault are so common that allows them to divert blame and attention away from societal faults and push them onto individual women. It's not the fault of that Russia has had specific changes of political institutions and economic well-being, which has led to the increases of rapes and assault. No, women are dressing too slutty and flirting too much. It's not the fault of a society that we can change, it's the fault of individual women, making individual choices which lead to individual rapes. This hyper-individualistic approach allows the modern people in power to sidestep any responsibility they might have as leaders to address the problem and put it all on women to just act better, the moral equivalent of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. The reimposition of a more patriarchal system would even be devastating for men. The study I quoted earlier showing 7 million deaths in post-USSR countries after the collapse also shows that the most affected group of this rapidly increasing mortality was actually working-age men. By taking economic independence away from women and forcing men into the situation of being the provider, while making them live in a society of rampant unemployment, men who have been unable to fill that archetype of breadwinner-provider have suffered immensely. The reintroduction of a greater system of patriarchy has been devastating to both men and women. W.E.B. Du Bois, the co-founder of the NAACP and a major contributor to the American Civil Rights Movement, said of his trip to the Soviet Union that, "The Soviet Union seems to me the only European country where people are not more or less taught and encouraged to despise and look down on some class, group, or race. I know countries where race and color prejudice show only slight manifestations, but no white country where race and color prejudice seems so absolutely absent. In Paris, I attract some attention. In London, I meet elaborate blackness. Anywhere in America, I get anything from complete ignoring to curiosity and often insult. In Moscow, I pass unheeded. Russians quite naturally ask me for information. Women sit beside me quite confidently and unconsciously. children are uniformly courteous. Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer and anti-imperialist, said of his visit to the Soviet Union that, "I jogged in the mornings in strange places where they hardly ever saw a black man. I ran past two little white Russian ladies who were walking to work. They didn't look around and ask what I was doing. I can't go jogging in some streets in America in the morning in a white neighborhood. If they see a black man coming down the street, they wonder who I'm going to jump. I love things like this that I notice. Late at night, I was running down the street and I looked back. Again, there were two Russian ladies. They didn't even look back to see why a black man was out there running." Black Americans, who invariably came from a country of intense racial hatred and oppression, nearly unanimously agreed that the Soviet Union was much more progressive on its racial policy than the United States. But maybe you don't think we should judge Soviet racism by its treatment of American racial minorities. After all, we don't judge American racism by our treatment of Soviet ethnic minorities, Kazakhs, Uzbek, Tatars, etc. So how did the Soviet Union treat its own ethnic minorities? Well, the historian Terry Martin, one of the West's leading historians on Soviet ethnic policy, as well as someone who is very willing to be critical of the Soviet Union, has written that the Soviet Union was the first country in world history to establish affirmative action programs for national minorities, and no country has yet approached the vast scale of Soviet affirmative action. Tsarist Russia was one of the most ethnically diverse nations in human history. Any nation that takes up 11 time zones kinda has to be, from the Orthodox Western peoples to the more Eastern and predominantly Muslim Asian peoples. Unfortunately, tied to this was the fact that Tsarist Russia was also one of the most racist countries in human history. Many of the largest and most famous non-Russian languages in the empire, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Polish, Yiddish, etc., were actively suppressed and in many cases banned by the state. Their bigotry against both their Asian and European colonies was famous, from the Tsar calling the Japanese a monkey race just before losing them in 1905, to mass systemic genocides like the Circassian genocide. But by a significant margin, the group Tsarist Russia was the most bigoted against was its Jewish population. Jews were prohibited from entering the government and were forced into what were called the Pale Settlements, communities where Jews were trapped and forbidden to leave. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, perhaps the most famous anti-Semitic writing in history outside of Mein Kampf, was actually written by the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana. And unfortunately, as Imperial Russia was forced into greater and greater decline, it and its supporters would commit even worse acts of bigotry. Viewer discretion is advised for this next part. I'm going to talk about massacres in moderate detail for a bit. If that's not your thing, feel free to skip to this timestamp. After the Bolshevik Revolution and the complete and utter collapse of Imperial Russia, the right-wing supporters of the old regime, the Whites as they were called, would kill between 100 and 150,000 Jews throughout the empire in general, but usually Ukraine specifically, and force 300,000 Jewish children into homelessness. These are what history usually refers to as the pogroms, a word that has a similar meaning to Jews as the word lynching has to black Americans. These killings were usually carried out by militias, be they the White Army, the Cossacks, the Black Hundreds, etc. While I don't want to be grotesque, and I'll try to be short here, it is important, I think, to understand just how large a role rape played in this anti-Semitic genocide. About 1/3 of the female Jewish population of Ukraine would be raped, with this usually committed in the streets in front of relatives, with most cases of sexual violence carried out by groups of 8 to 10 men per Jewish girl. These rapes had such a traumatic effect on the well-being of the Jewish population that their birth rates plummeted for years, largely as a result of trauma and fear of physical intimacy, even in the safety of their own homes and with men they cared about. This genocide would be ended by the Bolsheviks as a result of the Soviet state's brutal suppression of all anti-Semitic activity. The Soviet secret police, the Cheka, was flocked to by Jewish survivors of the pogroms and used to infiltrate, assassinate, and destroy pogrom activity. Jews even flocked to the Red Army in such great numbers that a special recruitment section for the Jews was created, the Jewish War Section. Even the book Legacy of Blood that I've been quoting here, a book very comfortable critiquing the Soviet Union on anti-Semitism, concedes that the Soviet Union saw the virtual disappearance of pogroms, eliminating the vast majority of them. The Bolsheviks would give Jews back their stolen houses, abolish the Pale Settlements, allow Jews to speak their own languages and rule in government, and would become the first European state to make anti-Semitism illegal, and even, just before World War II, accept Jews from Eastern Europe and move them safely to the eastern part of the Soviet Union, saving the lives of hundreds of thousands to perhaps over 1 million Jews from the invading Nazis. From one of the most anti-Semitic countries in human history to one of the greatest defenders of Jewish people ever, there is a reason why the vast majority of famous Jewish intellectuals from the first half of the 20th century were at the very least communism curious. But the anti-racist reforms wouldn't stop there. The Soviet Union also carried out a number of other changes. In each national territory, the language of the titular nationality was to be established as the official state language. National elites were to be trained and promoted into positions of leadership in the party, government, industry, and schools of each national territory. They even promoted the national folklore of ethnic minorities as opposed to the constant cultural genocide committed by the Russian Empire. The heavy emphasis the Soviet Union put on preserving and expanding the culture of its minorities is why the vast majority of them became literate in their own languages. Compare this to America's treatment of the culture of its own ethnic minorities. Only 5.4% of Native Americans can actually speak their own language, and while estimates vary, according to Ethnologue, of the 115 indigenous languages spoken in the U.S. today, 2 are healthy, 34 are in danger, and 79 will go extinct within a generation without serious intervention. In other words, 99% of all Native American languages spoken today are in danger. By another estimate, nearly 1/3 of Native American languages that existed in 1998, within the lifetime of most people watching this, have already died. The Soviet Union was significantly more progressive in preserving the right to culture of its own people than the United States is quite literally a century later. When it comes to interracial marriage, the Soviet Union was leagues above the United States at the time as well. At the time of the Soviet Union's founding, they transformed marriage from a religious ceremony to a civil union. With this, relationships of people in different nationalities would become easier and more widespread, with the state and academia actively encouraging and promoting interracial marriage. 13.5% of marriages in the Soviet Union of 1967 were international, compared to about 3% in the United States at a similar time. In 1958, only 4% of Americans supported interracial marriage, while a large survey in the Soviet Union found that 39% of Russian rural people, so more traditionally conservative areas, opposed international marriage. This is obviously way too high, but proves that even in the more rural socially conservative parts of the Soviet Union, they supported international marriage significantly more than the United States, where the majority of the population would only begin to support interracial marriage in the mid-1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. This isn't even to mention the fact that some of America's progress in civil rights can actually be viewed through the lens of concessions to the Soviet Union in an attempt to win the Cold War. After the fall of the old European empires, many ex-colonies became important in this growing Cold War. In places like Africa, for instance, people would look at the US, where in the early Cold War lynchings and racial minorities was still de facto legal, and entire races were explicitly second-class citizens, and contrast this to the Soviet Union, where racial chauvinism was explicitly banned by the government, and the government, at least vocally, supported racial equality. The Soviet Union took basically every opportunity it could to contrast itself with the United States in this regard. This put America at a significant disadvantage in the Cold War, which is something that even large chunks of the American population accepted at the time. American officials constantly got questions from third world officials about the treatment of their minorities. This would help contribute to America being willing to making more concessions to the civil rights movement.